Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. Hi all. Couple quick notes about today's episode. First, this is a explicit episode. There is no censoring. So I didn't want any of Devanon's personality to be limited. And so if bad words offend you and, this is not the episode for you. But if that is your disposition, you should stretch yourself to listen to this, even if explicit language upsets you, because Devanon's message is super important, and I'm so glad he came on. And in that spirit, my second point is I fucked up. I fucked up my audio somehow. I don't know what happened, but my original audio for this episode was pretty much unlistenable. Devanon sounds great. I sound like shit. So I went back and I re-recorded my entire side of the conversation. So hopefully I did my best acting job and it sounds like we're really talking and y'all can get the feel of the original conversation. I tried to ask questions almost word for word and react exactly how I did during the interview. But if there's any spots that feel a little stilted, that's why. It's my second take. Again, if the original audio was salvageable, I would have used that. But it was literally like I was talking into a tin can. And I did not want y'all to click away because of bad audio quality. And it would be a crime if y'all missed out on this great conversation on account of my technical mishap. So enjoy drugs. On today's show, we have Devanon Hubert. He is the author of Sex, Drugs, and Jesus, which is a memoir about his struggles with drug addiction, drug dealing, homelessness, serving in the armed forces, contracting HIV and hepatitis B, and rejection from his church. He hosts a podcast under the same title, where he talks about the taboos surrounding sexuality, drug use, and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I'm so happy he agreed to come on, and I'm happy to introduce him to y'all. Devanon, welcome to the show.
Hey man, how are you? How are you?
I'm doing really good. I'm so glad you came on. This is awesome. I was on your show a while back, and it's great to have you here. The first question I ask almost every guest is, how did you relate to Christianity the first 18 years of your life?
Yeah, am I allowed to say profane words on your show? I wanted to be sure before I defile your podcast.
Well, I used to normally no, but for you, yes, please do not filter yourself. Swear away.
Okay, fan-fucking-tastic.
I'm assuming there's a bit of sarcasm there. Go on, just tell us what all was related to those first 18 years.
First 18 years of my life, John, I let it control me. I didn't have my own mind. I was a mindless sheep, which is exactly what they like to keep in the fold. And so whatever they said, I did. I didn't question it. I didn't challenge it. When I did maybe try to ask a question, it was immediately shot back down. So I was dominated by Christianity for the first 18 years of my life.
Wow. Would you say that was you specifically, your whole family? How did all of that play out?
I dare say anybody who attends a Pentecostal church at length like that, is allowing it to control them. I mean, I can't speak for what was going on in the heads of other people, and maybe they didn't agree with all of it, to be fair, but I don't know if they felt dominated. But I just, I only realized that this was happening within the last few years, and I'm almost 40. So, they like to control you and they have a tight leash.
When you were experiencing it at the time, did you feel like you were being controlled? How did you feel at the time?
I knew that there was some shit fucked up, but I also had seen God move, in those churches. The Holy Ghost is real. And I've seen some authentic things happen, and I've experienced it myself. So I'm like, I know it's real, not because someone told me, but because God has revealed Himself to me. But if you're telling me I'm not supposed to drink alcohol ever, or listen, but I'm reading this Bible and it's not saying that, you know. For instance, it's warning against drunkenness and excess, not alcohol. And I bring this up in church, and they're like, "Well, just don't do it." That sort of thing. I'm like, I don't know, but I guess I'm gonna stay anyway. Rationalizing it, trying to make it make sense.
Gotcha. And that's definitely a Pentecostal environment. Let me ask you this. How would you describe your spirituality now? Because I believe you still believe in Jesus, but you don't call yourself a Christian. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, these Christian folks can go fuck themselves. Or like Gandhi said, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. Like I say, the further I get away from church, the closer I get to God.
Well, that's interesting because would you still say Jesus is God?
But yeah, I'm all for the Trinity: God, Jesus Christ, Holy Ghost, all them. But I don't feel like I need to go to a church to find Him. He already found me. I don't need the motherfuckers.
Hmm. That's so interesting. So that process of leaving church then, how was that? Was that a very gradual thing? Was there like a singular plot point? Was there an event? Was there anything like that? Tell us about leaving the church.
Well, at Lakewood Church under the great Joel Osteen in Houston, Texas, I was kicked out for not being straight. And so, and that was that.
Sure enough. So, but that was the point you were like, I'm done with church completely, not just this church, all church.
That was when my heart left. After, and then that experience led to me being homeless and getting into drugs and everything, as I was trying to fill the void and the hole in my life and heart, and mind that catastrophic experience left. Once I was done being homeless and I was back in Louisiana after having lived in Houston, Texas, I did go back to the Pentecostal church that I grew up in, but not because I really wanted to go to the church, but because my spiritual leader, the prophetess, the great clairvoyant evangelist, Dorothy Nelson, was still, the pastor there, and she was just my personal mentor. And so I went there to get close to her. After she died, and then I stopped fucking with churches altogether. There was no reason for me to go.
Gotcha. Is there anything you miss about church? Like, why was there something about church that kept you going back? I'm curious about how you relate to that particular angle now of just missing something about church. Is there anything?
No, I don't miss anything about it at all because I realized just how fake it was. Like when I got kicked out of Lakewood for whatever their fucked up reasons are, those people didn't call me, to check on me, to see or whatever was going on. When I was a drug dealer, if a dope boy didn't come around for a couple of days, hell, we went looking. We put out the call. We need to go find Tron, find Tyrone, or whoever the fuck. Church people don't do that. Once they decide you're a heretic or you're not worthy or you're less than them, they just write you off and move the fuck on, which is not what the Lord said do. He said to stop everything and go find one lost sheep, but church people do not act that way. And so, no, I don't miss their judgmental asses. I don't miss their fake. I don't miss their fakeness. Those people just ain't real.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, like sometimes I'll get in my head and I'll miss the community, but then I realize I'm missing a community that never was. It definitely was fake. That's a very interesting analogy, by the way, of a drug dealer actually paying attention to its customers more than a
Mm-hmm.
more than a church is paying attention to its flock. You've mentioned several times now. You've brought up drugs, and drug dealing and that kind of thing. What was your very first introduction to drugs?
I was with this dude, and me, I was this like bleeding heart bottom, looking for a top, and every top I met was just gonna be my husband. End of story. It's decided. And so I was just a foolish little girl running around there and letting these men use me and lie to me. Um, well, he had ecstasy in his fuck bag, and so um, men had offered me drugs, ever since I left home to go to the military. But I always said no. I either had the military to do or church to do or something. But I had none of that anymore. And I was rebelling against Lakewood and against the church, and I was angry, and I didn't realize it. at the time that I was acting out. And so it was ecstasy. And I was like, sure. I used to say no to like drugs and all of that. Once I got kicked out of church, I started saying yes to everything I used to say no to.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, that sounds fairly normal. Like a lot of people when they get out of a sheltered environment or even their own homes, like think about college, it's a time of a lot of experimentation. So that tracks. Your story makes sense. What was the transition like from experimenting with drugs to dealing drugs? How did that all play out?
Mathematics. And I didn't realize what a serial entrepreneur that I was at the time. I just started to put two and two together. I was introduced to a meth dealer, and then he offered me a job to deliver drugs for him, and I accepted it. Not that I needed it, but he offered me a replacement church. He had a house. It was a trap house, church house, trap house. Not that much of a damn difference, except for there was more love and acceptance in the trap house. And so I was like, okay, I'll just do it. And then I was like, okay, so if this 8 balls of meth is going to cost me, I don't know, $90, and I can get like, I don't know, $150 from my friends, for their gram or whatever, then I can use that to actually buy more, give them their shit, and have enough to cover my own. But being the greedy Sagittarius that I am, I was like, how much further can I take this? So,
Well, and that makes sense. The mathematics of it all, right? Like it's just a financial thing to some extent. But what were your shame levels like? Did you feel like you were doing something wrong? Did you feel like this is great? Were you just apathetic about it all? Tell us about how you were feeling during those times.
I felt powerful. I felt accepted, and I stopped judging myself. I stopped, in the church questioning everything that I did, and I just didn't give a fuck about nothing. I went from overcorrecting myself and being overly harsh on myself to giving no fucks at all. Whatever it was, I was like, hell yes. Didn't care how illegal, how whatever. I was like, let's roll.
Wow. I mean, talk about liberation, right? Like that's what it sounds like. And I have a lot of thoughts about everything you just said, but the thing that's sticking out is what you're describing is almost what churches promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea of being liberated and having all this power. I'm curious, how did you understand drugs maybe when you were younger? Were you aware of drugs? Like what was your perception of drugs, let's say when you were a younger like child, like before you had experimented with them?
Mm, I mean, they had the whole dare to keep the kids off drug campaign and shit. They'd come around to the schools and be like, drugs are bad. You saw the fucking commercials on TV. This is an egg and a skillet scrambling. This egg is your brain. This is your brain on drugs, with this egg in the skillet. And the church was all like, no, 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 no. So I just accepted what they said and was like, no, 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 no. The boys would do drugs at school. I think I saw my oldest brother puking up cocaine one time when I was a kid, but I was sheltered. I grew up in the hood, crack houses everywhere. But my parents never let me out the yard. And so I didn't have it. I knew about it, but not really deeply. And then nobody really explained it to me in depth.
Did you have any kind of like knowledge of like the gap between, we'll say, like meth and weed? Like obviously those two are different now. So maybe I'll ask it this way: like what age did you start realizing like different drugs do different things, have different levels of whatever? When did you start understanding more about drug education, I guess?
Probably as I began discovering them. Now, I think I heard that methamphetamines existed when I was a military recruiter because a part of the Air Force regulation, I had to screen people and ask them about their drug use, and they're very particular. Like if you've used meth this many times or heroin or whatever, I couldn't have told you what any of that looked like. And when I was a recruiter, and I was like around 21, 22, had no idea. And so I probably wasn't until I did the shit for the first time that I saw what the fuck it was. I was very from the country, very green around the gills, very like before Tina Turner was Tina Turner and she was Anime Bullock growing up in Nutbush, Tennessee. I raised chickens and rabbits and shit.
Yeah, my neck of the woods, Georgia. Good old country boys. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're really learning the most about drugs as you're doing them. Am I hearing that correctly?
Mm-hmm. You sure is.
Wow. That's pretty crazy. So, what were your guiding ethics when you were dealing drugs, or maybe your 10 commandments, or whatever it is? Like in your head, what defined like a good drug dealer versus a bad drug dealer? What were your ethics in regards to drug dealing, if you had any?
I was not allowed, nor did I have the knowledge or skill set to cut the dope. The meth cooks and the people like that I rolled with strictly forbade it. So there was no cutting the product. And for me, if a person paid for $50 worth of shit, then they got $50 worth of shit. I wasn't about to shortchange them. If I had, large shards and stuff like that, which I always did, I wouldn't like crush it or try to make it look funny. I wanted to give them like the best that I had. So I tried to show up on time. So timeliness, quality of the product, not skimming, and then providing everything. It was full service. So I sold everything from heroin to crack to cocaine to weed to Vicodin and Allure tabs. I had syringes. I had pipes. One-stop shop, bitch.
Wow. I mean, that almost sounds like a business code of ethics, right? Like, almost sounds kind of corporate. Is that accurate? That like that it felt more businessy than anything else?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because what I did was I took my recruiter skills that I learned when I learned how to be a recruiter for the military and converted that into drug dealing. And it is known that military recruiters make exquisite drug dealers.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard this before and there is a lot of drug use and drug dealing in the military, though I know it's kind of a hush hush thing, but I've heard this before. So I assume that you got out of it, right? What made you get out?
Yeah, I don't do it anymore because I realized the trap, in that, and I didn't, and as I began to get whole again and begin to feel happy again, I did not need the fake validation that I got from having weak ass dope fiends falling all over me for their fix. Now, when I was insecure and I was vulnerable, and I let my narcissism rise within me, and I used my power over people to make myself feel good. Well, I'm happy now. I don't need that anymore.
Wow. I am struck by how identical that sounds to why I stopped becoming a pastor or stopped going down the journey to become a pastor, because just having that power was bad. It was damaging to me. And that sounds so similar to why you stopped dealing drugs. I know you used to work in churches. Does that the similarity strike you too, between leaving church and leaving the drug world for a happier and healthier life?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, the only difference is that a drug dealer is more honest than a preacher. People out there in the game do not act like what they're doing is right. Like people out there on them streets will be like, I know this shit I'm doing ain't right, but I might get right one day. I still believe in Jesus, but right now this is what it is. They not like a preacher who's like, "Hi everyone, everyone's great." Oh, and if a drug dealer don't like you, they're gonna be like, "Nigga, you need to get the fuck from off my steps before I shoot your ass or whatever." They not gonna lie to your face. If you're not wanted, they're gonna make it abundantly clear that you're not wanted, and they're gonna be like at church where everyone's welcome when that's bullshit. So there's more truth on the streets than there is in a church.
Wow. More truth in the streets than there is in a church. What a quote. What a relatable quote. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'll talk a little bit about my drug use, which is pretty minimal. I would say my main drug is coffee. just kidding. Yeah, coffee's great, but really it was my main vices are coffee and alcohol. There was a time when alcohol was like a problem. Back in 2018, my life was going very terrible, and but what's interesting is like both those drugs, especially alcohol. I mean, like I got it at a bar. Like I would just walk in, sit down, and order a drink, and someone would hand it to me at a business, at a legal business, and most of my things were not illegal. And yeah, and of course I've occasionally smoked tobacco and hookah, and I've tried weed, but like I don't really have an addictive personality, it doesn't seem. But when I was addicted to alcohol, it felt very mental. It wasn't necessarily a physical dependence, it was just a mental dependence because I was in pain. And so most of my drug use was so clearly related to the coping with the pain that I was in. For you, do you feel like in your experience that that a lot of your drug use was in some way just coping with pain?
It was like kind of like mid conscious for me. I didn't realize that I was using it to patch over the rage that I felt towards Lakewood Church. You know, sometimes I think about if I had had that first ecstasy pill and I wouldn't have been like in a bitter spot, if I would have turned into an addict, um, or not. I don't know, but and I hate it because I love to go out and dance and have fun and stuff like that. But the deeper I got into the drugs, then into the dealing and stuff, it began to like kind of interrupt the social life, and so and I became more reckless on the drugs, than I was off of them. And then, then I ended up getting, like you said, like hepatitis B and HIV and stuff like that. And so, I don't know. It's just like it's all like fucked, man.
It's an interesting point because I do view drugs as kind of a social thing. Like when I was drinking alcohol, I think I justified a lot of my alcohol use as like a social thing. But truly deep down inside, it was not a social thing. That was just the excuse. It was it was a means of escaping my own story in a lot of ways. It was a version of numbing. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. It means a lot. You're quite a vulnerable person. Although what's fun is when it comes out of your mouth, it seems that you're so above the stigmatization of these issues that it doesn't even sound vulnerable. It sounds very natural. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you too. As you when you talk about like the how easy it was for you to get the liquors and how it's more socially accepted. I always think about how when people go to their doctors and they get prescribed pills, you don't like in your situation, they don't have to worry about getting arrested. There's no running from the police. You can just go to Walgreens, Walmart, and get your dope refilled, and then do as many pills as you want. I think it's a little bit harder for people who have an alcohol problem or a prescribed pill problem to come to terms with the fact that it is a problem because society hasn't demonized you like that. Just the substance you're using isn't like demonized.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really, really, really good point.
Hello, listeners. My name is Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, a long-format interview-based show that focuses on cults, high-demand groups, captive organizations, and more. Each week, I interview a different cult survivor who brings a story of coercion and exploitation along with their own fight for freedom. With nearly 200 survivor interviews from all over the world, you can also find deep dives into infamous cults, interviews with leading experts in the field, and understand more about how cults exist all around us, and none of us are safe. Each month, I feature a different author on the show who has penned a compelling memoir about their cult experiences, which we discuss at length on the show, with copies of their books available to listeners. You will never be short of insightful and moving content here at the Cult Vault podcast, available on all major platforms.
Before we get in too much farther into this, we should probably try to define what drugs are, which will probably be kind of hard because dictionary definitions of drugs are largely unhelpful. They say something like a substance that has a physiological effect on the body, which could be food, that could be anything. But for this conversation, I'm going to use the word drug as a non-medically necessary substance with noticeably adverse effects to physical health or state. So things like alcohol or coffee would count, because and I'm going to count weed in that, though I think there's an argument to be had there. But my point is not to shame drug use, but to normalize it. It's a normal thing to take non-medically necessary substances. And the reason I'm saying non-medically necessary is just because I'm not talking about pills that people need to survive. So going forward, how do you feel about that definition?
Shit, it sounds better than the anonymous movement.
Oh, really? What's their definition of a drug?
It's mood and mind altering substances.
That could mean anything. That's not great.
Yeah, I feel like your definition is better. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole of the anonymous movement, because those fools don't even fucking consider coffee and tobacco to be mood mind altering substances. Which, your definition includes that because they totally are.
Yeah. I mean, well, and like, so there's the reason I put it the way I do is because there are things like insulin, like I don't want to put in the category of drug for this conversation, or even some mental health drugs that probably do alter your mood significantly. That's still not something I'm talking about, because I'm not worried about things that have positive effects. I'm worried about things that have adverse effects on your physical health or state of mind, even if it's temporary, at least a state of mind thing. So, and the reason I say non-medically necessary is just, that's just not the conversation I want to have for right now. I when I'm talking about drugs, I'm talking about recreational drug use. And it's hard because obviously coffee, weed, cocaine, and meth are four very, very different things. And I don't want to say they're the same. I mean, it's very hard to say the word drugs and have an umbrella. But yeah, a non-medically necessary substance with noticeably adverse effects to physical health or state of mind is I think, what I'm concerned with today, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, a person can overdo anything. When I think about excess, it just depends on when is too far for each individual. But that could be anything from watching television to hovering over your children. Anything taken too far becomes harmful, whatever it is. You can go to church too damn much.
Well, yeah, sure. I certainly believe that. But I guess for this conversation, I'm still more in the space of like a substance that you could either like inject or take, or, swallow, that kind of thing. Let's use alcoholism as an example. So alcoholism has been classified as a disease since the 50s, but there's still a lot of disparaging rhetoric and stigmatization about addiction is not a disease. It's a mere choice. But in the case of alcoholism, it is a chronic disease of the brain. So is all addiction. So would you say that addiction is the main risk when it comes to substance abuse?
No, because as you stated earlier, the long-term health effects. Like, I wonder, what is creeping up on a person, like in their body, that they may not know about by constantly exposing their body to such extremes. So what I mean is when you do meth, cocaine, crack, you raise your body temperature. You might not overdose, but every time you do that, are you stretching out like your blood vessels? Are you overworking your heart? And everything we put in our body goes through our liver. So is this going to result in some sort of sickness decades down the road?
Yes. I think this is so important, the point you're bringing up, because I think it's actually super bad and puritanistic to view addiction as the problem. It should be looked at as people's physical health is the main issue with substance abuse. Because if you have a worldview where sin is bad and addiction is sin, then sure, you're going to think addiction is bad. But I don't really care about that. I care about people's physical health. So yes, thank you for bringing up that point. That's super important.
Yeah, as Madonna said, I'm bored with the concept of right and wrong. It's just too overly simplistic. Shit ain't that damn simple.
It is definitely not simple. It's interesting when you think about the history of drug use, because it's a history of experimentation, but it's also a history of criminalizing people groups. Should the conversation be about individual freedom more than social good? Or better put, is there a conversation that can be had about the health of society, at least in this substance abuse, drug abuse idea, or just drug use in general. Can we talk about both individual freedom and social good, or should we not even really worry about the health of society?
I feel like it's about the individual, because I mean, there's always a whole test for the world to try to find out where the rights of the individual ends and where the rights of society is supposed to take over. But what we've gotten into is the area of fear mongering and projection. So to say that everybody who shoots up crystal meth is going to go rob Walmart is not true. You have people who go and rob shit anyway just because they like to steal shit. There are people who just want to do their meth and go home and fuck for 4 days and they're not trying to bother nobody. And so I say wait until a person does something to, go after them or whatever, rather than assuming just because they're high that they're automatically going to go and do something bad.
That's such an important point. Because the reason it's so important is like that we should probably be, it sounds more fair what you're talking about is holding an individual responsible for their actions and not attacking the influence. But it does raise interesting questions, because I think about like a DUI, right? Like, people can kill other people with a car, whether they are under the influence or not. But the idea behind the law is it's supposed to deter people. It's supposed to deter people from driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I don't actually know that. I feel like it does, but I'm not sure that it does. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think DUIs deter people from driving under the influence?
I think if somebody's had a DUI, or maybe if they're super close to somebody who's had one, they might be influenced by it. But before that, it's, we have this thing like we keep poking the pig. If we haven't gotten caught, we might keep doing it. I mean, I drove drunk a bunch of times. I wrecked some shit one night. I really wasn't drunk. I was just more like fatigued on that night, but still I had been to the bar. I never, the threat of being arrested never stopped me. It never stopped me from selling drugs. Fear is not a great motivator. And the Lord has not given us a spirit of fear, so we are not supposed to use fear and intimidation to try to coerce people into whatever behavior we believe they should be exhibiting.
What's so interesting is I agree with you completely, but then this DUI example kind of trips me up, because I definitely agree that there's some people who will just drive drunk or drive high, regardless of the law. But even in my own life, I'm like, no, like the idea of a DUI has stopped me from like, or has like made me take an Uber instead of driving to an event, or like handed friends keys before, that kind of thing. But you're right. There's also sometimes you test the boundaries, right? Where you're like, I'm not drunk, I'm just tipsy, so you drive. So that's definitely an interesting example. I'm not sure what I think about all that.
People get into a state of mind. People get into a state of mind, man, where they don't think it can happen to them.
That's so true in so many areas of life.
Right. That's just how people are. And and it wasn't until I went through everything. I've got like 4 felonies now. I understand how easy it is to get into trouble and how hard it is to get out of trouble. And no matter how much I was warned, John, it wasn't until it happened that I was like, oh shit, maybe I should think about shit before I go leaping out there. Some people are just hard-headed like that.
Yeah. Purely out of curiosity, and feel free not to answer, what are your felonies?
Well, let me see. The first one, narcotics possession. The second one, 2 other possession ones, and then 1 forgery of financial instrument.
Yeah, wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that still affects you, right? Because I've talked to other felons, and once you have a felony, you can be pretty screwed here in this country. So I'm assuming that still affects you to this day.
Fuck me in the tits with a dick, it is. Oh my God. Like,
well, yeah. Well, thanks for not giving up. I would assume that feels kind of defeating once you have that label slapped on you.
I couldn't get a job anywhere. I tried to go volunteer at a fucking museum They pulled my background check and was like, no, we don't want you to volunteer here. I tried to go to Louisiana State University to get some new education. They were like, nope, because of your background, you cannot pay us your money to go to school here. And that is why we have what's called recidivism. Because instead of constantly being rejected, you go, okay, well, I can go make a few $1,000s today selling this dope. Why the fuck am I going to keep letting these people demonize me from my past? So I had to start off being a janitor after I was homeless at the Department of Veterans Affairs and Medical Clinic in a special program they have for homeless veterans and people with serious mental health issues. And that's how I began to work my way back up. So I was a janitor, then I began delivering food, then I worked at a restaurant, then enough time had passed for me to be licensed as a massage therapist. So I went back to school for that for the second time, and then went on from there, started the podcast, started writing books. But yeah, I mean, those things are still on my record today. I couldn't get my global entry, when you fly and stuff like that because of that background. And so, and this shit's over 10 years old now. People like to hold grudges. But one thing I appreciate about the coronavirus pandemic is it took the teeth away from judgmental ass employers who were so nitpicky. Now we have all these jobs and nobody wants to go do them. So employers have had to humble their fucking selves. But before that, your shoestrings aren't cute enough. You're not getting the job. Shit like that.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, if anything good came out, instead of corporate driven ethics, there's a lot of desperation ethics, which isn't great, but it's true that one good thing is that people are able to get hired who weren't before. This is an important topic, though, because we're talking really about stigmatization. Because in the U.S., drugs like coffee and alcohol, as we've talked about, are not nearly as stigmatized as things like weed or cocaine. So where do you think drug stigma comes from in each culture that it's there?
The media does a lot of it because, whenever you watch a documentary on whatever channel, be it, Drugs, Inc. or whatever, every time they show a meth head, the bitch has no teeth, skin is falling out, and they're running across the field butt-ass naked. There is that, but they never show on documentaries or in the media somebody who makes $500,000 a year who shoots up meth every weekend after they go pick up a hustler from the block. And then they show back up to work on Monday like nothing's wrong and they own vacation homes. I had clients like that. But that doesn't make good TV. So people who sit in their happy American homes watching television drawing conclusions about people are only seeing one half of the narrative.
That's interesting. Why do you think that media... Well, do you think that media narrative is intentional? Do is it they just don't want to glorify drugs? They don't want people to use drugs so they don't portray it more normal? Or is that just their excuse for portraying it more stigmatized?
I think they need ratings, first of all. And nobody wants to see a good, fun, happy story. People want tragedy. And that's been since the days of the Roman Empire. People like a good tragic fucking performance. But what they're doing, if they are trying to be safe, is they're being overprotective. They're doing what the church does where they just say no to everything. How about say no sometimes and yes sometimes, learn how to balance the shit out rather than no all the time, because it's not realistic and it's not sustainable. And people will rebel against you once they know the truth.
Well put. Let's talk about sobriety for a minute, because I'm a big believer that sobriety should be celebrated when someone overcomes an addiction. But there's this issue of people thinking sober people are more moral. So what do you think? Do you think it's morally better for a person to be sober rather than not?
Depends to me how you use your time. Everything is about time. So if God were to take a snapshot of your life, and look at it and go, okay, today you spent 5 hours high. You talked to me for about 60 seconds or not at all. You fucked for another hour or two, played video games for 3. It's out of balance to me. I don't think vice should consume anybody's life. I don't care what it is, be it sex, video games, whatever. I think it should be should be proportion. So I don't think that there's low morality in drugs. I mean, it's just not, I don't just think it's inherently evil because it exists.
Sure. And I don't either. But let me spin it this way. A tale of two sober people. If there's a sober person who overcame an addiction versus a sober person who's just never tried anything, is there a difference between those people or their kind of sobriety?
Two different kinds of people. Some people are just not drawn to drugs. I mean, there's not that much in this world that everybody needs except for water, food, shelter, and clothing. There's some people who are just eunuchs and just don't want to have sex. There are those of us who are just drawn to more exuberating things like that. And it is cultural too. Like, I was in the Middle East the other week, and people over there don't drink a lot of alcohol. It's hard to find a bar. Like, say if you're in Oman or something like that, and they have very strict rules. They're just not about that life. Now, are there people over there drinking and doing drugs? Of course, but it's not prevalent. It's all very private. So some of it's cultural, some of it's personality, and some of it just won't be.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not a commentary on their morality. It has more to do with predisposition and personality, things like that.
But weak little insecure bitches, like to find. You're probably gonna have a lot of editing to do with all this cussing I'm doing. So.
No. This is gonna be an explicit episode, so don't worry. Be yourself. Go crazy.
So when weak little bitches and narcissistic assholes want to find a reason to step on somebody, drugs is an easy thing to do. It's just easy because society supports that. Take I don't know, Aaron Carter, who just died, Whitney Houston. People look at them and go, "Oh my goodness," judgment, judgment, judgment. I'm like, how about compassion, compassion, compassion? It's a choice. I love the weaknesses and things like that, and that God has put into the world. Because when people present as weak or frail, what are we going to do? Are we going to take this opportunity to shit on them while they're already down? Are we going to even pray for them? We're going to do something to make their situation worse. The Lord is using these things to try and test people and to hold them to account one day.
What's fascinating is I don't agree with that last thing you said at all. But what I do agree with is where you're talking about compassion over everything. That I definitely agree with. And yeah, it's super strange when people really take a shit on or dunk on people after they die. I think that's pretty telling of a person's character when they are trying to beat someone down who's literally dead. But when we're critiquing people at all, it should have an aim, right? Which might sound kind of funny coming from a guy like me who spends so much of his time critiquing Christianity, but I have a goal. I want Christianity to either A, get better, or B, go away. Because as it stands right now, it is not helping individuals and it is not helping society.
No, it isn't. And I like the way you said that. A, get better, or B, go the fuck away. Get out and don't come back.
Yeah, definitely. How would you describe American Christianity's relationship with drugs or drug users?
Behind closed door, like Mr. Jerry Falwell, they have great relationship with drug users from their pulpits. They can't have that. It's like this Carrie Lake bitch over in Arizona, who was trying to be a governor, and she got her ass beat. And when she was talking so much shit about drag queens and whatnot, and then that one drag queen, I can't think of her fucking name, came out and put her on blast and was like, "Oh, okay, so this bitch wants to talk shit about drag queens now, but I used to go to her house and put on shows for her friends." Okay.
Yeah, it's like a disingenuine relationship with drugs.
I'd say it's hypocritical and not true. But preachers do dope. Preachers have orders and they fucking do everything everybody else does. It's just it's a different set of rules. As you say sometimes, John, they have a different set of rules for their flock than they do for themselves.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Because if you think about the stigmas around stigmatized drugs or even non-stigmatized drugs, like, in some Baptist cultures, like a drop of alcohol is the worst thing ever. But in these cultures, if you get caught and you're a follower with a drug of any kind that's stigmatized in their little cult, you might have to go before the church, you might get excommunicated, you might have to go through some form of church discipline. But if a leader was caught, there'd probably be some consequences, that he might have to, step down for a while or permanently. He might, suffer some shame. But in 2 years, he'll probably be able to just say, I'm sober, and go teach at another church. Like these things happen all the time. So you're right. Yeah, there's that clear distinction between leaders and followers playing out even in this conversation. So what are some drugs, or maybe we'll even say addictions in general, that Christians are less concerned about than these drugs we've been talking about, but they probably should be concerned about? What comes to your mind, the drugs or addictions that Christians do not stigmatize, I guess you could say?
I think people are addicted to politics. I think that's what stands out to me the most, because it really, really disturbs me the way people fawn over the physical leaders of this world. People get all upset. They go storm capitals. They go bash old men in the head and shit like that because of how stirred up they get over politics. I feel like people are addicted to politics. I feel like the church and the world has made a god out of politics and out of politicians. And so for me, the worst things that people get addicted to are each other, or them and themselves.
Okay, this is really interesting because I'm going into journalism, and one of the things I've talked about in Jay's school is about this, like, there's a lot more to journalism than politics, but so much of journalism in both my classroom settings and out there in the world is focused on politics. But it's interesting you call the church addicted to politics, because I'm wondering if it's addiction to politics, if it's addiction to power, because politics, right, is from the same word as policy, and churches want to have that control. They want to be policy makers. They want to dictate policies. So do you think is it an addiction to politics? That's such an interesting framing. Is it an addiction to politics, or is it just kind of a means to an end? Is politics a means to their end of power? What do you think about that?
For the preachers, it's a means to an end. For the non-preachers, it's an addiction. So for the lay people, for like non-preachy folk, so they're hovering on Twitter and Instagram every day, and and looking at everything Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or who the fuck ever. And the moment something shifts, or if the president does something wrong, they lose their shit and act like they have no faith in God, Jesus, or whatever. They cry depending on who's elected, and they say they like Jesus or love Jesus, but their anxiety and the way that they get shook just depends on what a Republican or a Democrat is saying. Acts like they believe more in they act like that politician has power over God. And then the preachers and stuff like that love hanging out with the politicians because they get to do like preachers like to do and have effect over the world. So, but that's their addiction to power.
That's such an interesting bifurcation. But I'm wondering if is it the leaders who are encouraging those people to be addicted to politics, or is that what you're pointing out, where it serves the pastor for them to be addicted to politics?
They want the church people want their constituents to be addicted to them. So if I'm a pastor and I'm a narcissist and I lead this church, I need you to be addicted to me. And so I pay attention to the things that make you afraid. So I'm going to go and lock arms with this politician and be sure we push their agenda, anti-abortion, anti-this, whatever it is. And then I'm going to preach about this from my pulpit. So it's the politicians, celebrities, preachers all work in tandem to keep the people who are not them worshiping them.
Almost an addiction to attention, right? It's just power over people too. I guess that would be a better use of Christians' time, is to pay attention to that rather large log in their eye rather than the speck in the drug community. If it's even a problem at all, you know.
Churches waste their time on a lot of shit, but in judging and condemning or chasing down certain lifestyles is a complete waste of time, but it caters to people's need to feel superior. And so if a preacher is going to stand in a pulpit and say, this whore over there is bad, or this, you can't masturbate, this horny teenager is bad, people in the congregation feel great because they go, okay, well, I'm not as fucked up as they are. So it's this whole like a narcissism buffet feast that's being dished out by these damn preachers, man. And people don't understand how they're being like manipulated and hypnotized into thinking they're righteous. See, when I was in the Christian church, them people had me thinking that I was so much better than the rest of the world. Somehow I was the lucky one who stumbled upon this here, and everybody else is going to go to hell. The Pentecostals were like, everyone else is going to go to hell except for us. I've heard very extreme versions of this, John, where a person has told me like their individual church told them only that church is going to heaven and the rest of the world is not. And then you have just different varieties scattered all across Christendom.
Right. Definitely. I mean, part of the work I do, I follow a lot of religious sects, but specifically a lot of Christian sects. And there are like these more progressive denominations of Christianity that are probably more into social justice, probably more queer affirming, just more liberal in general. But you almost see that same kind of addiction to attention or addiction to power in those circles. Or at least that's, I guess you could identify it that way. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about those more progressive churches and how they relate to maybe like this conversation of drug use?
Any church has an agenda. I don't give a fuck if they call themselves progressive or not, because they need money to keep coming in and keep those doors open, because you got staff and maintenance and janitors and drugs and whatever the fuck else they want to go buy. And which is fine. Shit, pastor can get high for all I give a damn. But I would not turn like a blind eye or an overly trusting eye on any of them, because they have too much power over people. Anybody who has that sort of power over people can become corrupt, and you're not going to just see it unless you have spiritual eyes to see. Because like a preacher is like either really, really strong or really, really weak. There's no in between, and that's just how I feel about that. So progressive or not, then it also depends to me, like if they're how progressive. Like I was reading an article about how the Mormon Church, Fellowship of Latter-day Saints, or the fuck you want to call them, are all like, we're for the equality marriage, the Marriage Equality Act, but we're still not, for gay marriage, but we think that this new bill passing through Congress right now is the way forward. So that's that lukewarm, not hot, not cold bullshit that these quote-unquote progressive churches do.
Yeah, there's some really interesting things going on with how Mormons are relating to this right to marriage BS, because it also affects the sects that believe in polygamy and stuff. Going back to this idea of stigmatization and Christianity, I think Christianity only stigmatizes drugs that could compete with their rhetoric. So because think about it. I mean, alcohol can be a part of communion. Coffee can be part of their fellowship. A lot of churches have coffee time. So culturally, certain drugs do just go against their perfectionist mindset. So in my worldview, it's actually a fear of competition. What do you think? Is it a fear of competition when it comes to drugs, or are they just following suit with America's culture of stigmatization of certain kinds of drug use? Is it that they're worried it's going to compete with their message, or are they just kind of mimicking the rest of society?
I think it's both. And churches are very, very dark places to begin with. And I'm not talking about the dark lights that they have in the theater so that they can hypnotize you with their glowy stage lights. They're just like spiritually dark. That's very fascinating the way that you describe that, in terms of them being in competition, they want, the addicts and everything to come there. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that I can disagree with. With that, I got caught up on what you said. Like, I know you asked me a question, but the way that you describe that, like them competing and basically trying to stamp out the damn competition, to keep the people coming to them, John. I hadn't thought of it like that before. like you could write a whole book on that.
Yeah. Well, the way my brain works is I'm always asking the question, why does the cult care? Because there's so many things they don't care about. Like, take alcohol, for example. Like, alcoholism is rampant in churches. Like, many, many, many of the white men in churches have some level of a drinking problem. And there's certainly cultures that, take communion, for example, that will have grape juice instead. But there's plenty that will have wine, and I mean, I had communion wine as young as 12 years old, right? And it was not stigmatized for a 12-year-old to have a little shot of wine every Sunday. But it's because they were allowed to make the rules. They were allowed to have that control. And I think that's a lot of time what's happening is it's just about who has the power to say what is good and what is bad, because they never talk about the effects of drugs, right? They talk about addiction to drugs, because if you frame the whole issue as addiction, you frame the whole issue as sin. And that's what they need to do in order for their theology to work. And so it's not about people's physical health. It's about whether they're sinning or not, and it's about whether they're going to submit to the church's authority. So yeah, I don't think it's just following suit with America's culture. I think it's absolutely a fear of competition, and that's why they stigmatize those practices.
It's a dark, dark world. It is a dark, dark world. What was that question you had asked me before I got mesmerized by your perspective?
No, I literally, I was just wanting to know your perspective, because you're obviously much more familiar with the drug world than I am. Do you think they're just following suit with America's culture? Are they just, is it because they politically align right sometimes, so they have this whole war of drugs mentality? Is it not related to their Christianity at all? Or do Christians have a version of stigmatization that is wholly their own? Like, they have their own agenda that's maybe more private, I guess.
The church takes its cadence from the world. They are not the thermostat. They are very much the thermometer. They move up and down based on popular opinion. For instance, Joel and Victoria, the leaders of Lakewood Church, when they were on Larry King years ago, and Larry King asked Joel his stance on LGBTQIA issues, Joel gave his classic deer in the headlight looks, like he don't know what the fuck people talking about, that bullshit he does. And and gave one of his non-answers about, well, I wasn't raised that way, or some bullshit like that. Then in a later interview, Joel was like, well, I'm against it. Now him and Victoria were on like Fox and Friends, going to do one of their arena tours or whatever bullshit. And now Joel and Victoria are like, well, it's not in the Bible, so we won't perform a gay marriage. But if our gay friends were getting married, we totally go to the wedding. I'm all like, bitch. Now, what's happened here? They've changed their story over the years to fit whatever is popular. So what happened? Coronavirus came to town. Gay rights got more popular. Churches starting to see a decline. Lakewood's not excluded from that. Okay, we got a lot of money. We got to keep this money coming in. So we're going to go on these shows and kind of not be for it, but also kind of not be against it. And so, okay, it wasn't until the Supreme Court legalized marriage that many churches got up and said, okay, well, we're going to respect, this whole gay marriage thing because the Supreme Court said to. Okay, it's good you did that, but you're the church. You should have been doing that shit any fucking way. You shouldn't have had to wait for the government to tell you what to do, church.
Wow. I mean, yeah, that's such a good point, because, my world's always been on the conservative side of things when I was a Christian, both theologically and politically. But yeah, I've never really thought about that. If progressive Christians really were for gay marriage, they absolutely could have started having gay ceremonies way before the Supreme Court decision. Probably some were, but definitely not the majority. That's a interesting point I hadn't thought about before.
Just listen, people. The church is going to keep their mouth shut until it's safe to come out and say something. Because it's easier to say, hey, gay people are welcome because the Supreme Court said so. They're the bad guy, not us. As opposed to, so they can deflect blame that way. The church has no nut sack at all. They are ballless.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've often brought up that, people think the number of evangelicals are going down, and I'm like, yes, like less and less people are going to identify that way. But the mindset, I mean, Christianity is quite adaptable. I mean, you think of what, before they were using the word evangelical, maybe 100 years ago, what Christianity looked like versus the evangelical movement's origins versus now. It's like 3 different religions, I mean, things changed. It's very adaptable. So I agree with you on that. Here's a question. Should evangelicals in their current state, they have like 12-step programs and different outreach programs for drug users. Should evangelicals in their current state be doing any outreach towards those with substance abuse problems, or could it be dangerous for them to involve themselves in that kind of quote-unquote ministry?
If the program is true, I don't want to believe that evangelicals are just like Satan reincarnate and there's not even a drop of good in them on any day of the fucking week. But if they're using whatever front like that to make money and then go support themselves, their own drug addictions and habits, or support political candidates, then fuck them. But if they're actually putting boots on the ground and coming up with practical ways to actually make a difference in the lives of people who are suffering, then sure, it would depend on the exact program and the people who are running it.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely it depends sort of situation. It's just I'm so cynical. I think that like, oh, this is almost like their way of recruiting people to their cult, right? Where it's a way for them to have reach towards particularly vulnerable people and abuse that and work into their systems. Like you said, yeah, maybe they outsource to someone more educated, but in general, I don't know. Am I too cynical about this?
No, because they are vulnerable, and predators don't go and look for strong people. As Lisa Left Eye from TLC said, there are no accidental death traps. This is all strategy. What zip code are they in? How can we profit from this? That sort of thing. Let's take pictures of us doing this, and then we're gonna, talking to these druggy people, and we're gonna use this for fundraising later. You never know how it could be being leveraged.
Right, definitely. And of course, I don't think Christians are Satan incarnate, and like there's lay people I'm usually less critical of because they're the cult followers, and I don't blame the cult followers as much as the cult leaders. In 12-step programs, I believe it's the 3rd or 4th question that it goes something like we hand ourselves over to the power, to a higher power or God as we understand him. It's phrased something quite similar to that, at least. I wonder if we'll disagree here, but I wanted to ask you, do you need God to get off drugs if you want to? Is that something that requires a belief in God?
I would say it depends on the level of addiction and the person and their belief system. It's like, do I need God to get up and walk across the room? Technically, no. But if I want to, because he's already empowered me, do I want to credit him for that? Maybe, maybe not. For me, yes, it took a strong deliverance, from God for me to come to balance. But then it depends on how you define get off drugs. For some people that's stopping everything. For some people that's harm reducing down to a less intense drug or less of the drug they do. It depends on what deliverance looks like. So it's easier to harm reduce than it is to cut everything out. Whether God is necessary, I think he's your surest bet. I think he's better than those anonymous programs. I've been through those 12 steps before. But It just depends on that person's level of faith. Some people say that they just had a bad experience and they never use the drugs again. So, I mean, but just as sure as, Moses, his rod turned into a serpent and Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing. There are some things in life that people can get with God and without God. It just depends.
Okay, I don't think we disagree then, because I don't particularly care to attack someone's personal spirituality, and it seems like you're in the same boat where it's up to the individual to decide, whether they need God to get off drugs, and I think that's a good approach. He's a bit problematic now, but I remember reading Russell Brand's book on called Recovery, and it was about addictions, and he rewrites the whichever step it is that says we give ourselves over to God as we understand him. He talks about how important that as we understand him bit is, but he rewrites the rule, are you on your own gonna unfuck yourself? Which I thought was a pretty fun way to rewrite it, and it basically to communicate it's more about seeking help than anything. So I don't know. I thought I liked the book a lot, and I found that phrase interesting. What do you think about that?
The as we understand him, bruh, like in those meetings, like literally, like your God could be the group itself. It could be your dick. It could be a grasshopper outside. Like there's like, it's just like whatever. Or you could not believe in anything. The problem I had with it was the limitations that those programs place on deliverance. I was like, well, my God is the Trinity. God has power over all things. There's no reason for me to be an addict for the rest of my life like you're trying to say I have to be. So my God is all powerful. He can deliver me from being an addict. But if the other dude's God is the grasshopper or his sponsor or the group conscious, then he does not have an all-powerful being working on his behalf. So therefore, he is going to stay an addict for the rest of his life because you told him to. And that's the clash I had with them, and that's why that's a huge part of the reason I'm not there anymore. I'm like, I'm not going to be a fucking addict forever because God is going to change this and balance me out. So fuck you.
Well, here's the thing, though. I mean, I'll have to push back here. I'll say that what you're talking about is that individual power to decide, though, to change that mindset. So to change the mindset that I'm not going to be an addict. Now, someone's faith in an all-powerful God, they have the right to attribute that to God, and I wouldn't argue with that. But I think there actually is a lot of power in the individual being the one to change the mind, not in necessarily the God they believe in. So the reason I say all that is I just think there can be an irreligious or non-spiritual way to frame this conversation. But that's my only pushback. I don't know. What do you think?
You can't when you're talking about those programs because those things are founded in religion. They are a spiritual program, and the whole point of them is to not divide spirituality from the sobriety journey. Now there's rational recovery. There's, other forms of recovery out there that don't have spirituality in it. And so I actually recommend those better than the spiritual ones because it's not so, they don't feel so culty and churchy, but it is important because all of those 12 steps always go back to the higher power. So if your higher power is a desk or a grasshopper, that's where you're leaning on to draw strength from, or if you don't have one, everything revolves around what that higher power is in those programs.
Gotcha. Okay, that clarifies some stuff. It's almost because the program demands the higher power, then it's like, yeah, the power has to be higher. So, or else it wouldn't make any sense. You wouldn't have a higher power that is not powerful, at least. Yeah. Let me ask you this. So there might be a range of listeners out there, right? Like there might be someone who's in like a cultish drug world, a cultish church, a cultish get sober program, or they might be, have never tried drugs. Maybe they're addicted and want to get off it. Maybe they're just reevaluating their relationship with drugs across the board. General spectrum of different kinds of people. What would be some advice or what would be some of the most important things you would say in regards to in regards to drugs? Either general advice or just what you would want that whole spectrum to know.
I'm going to say, before I answer that, I don't think that the drug world is culty like the church and like the anonymous movement. And that's because, there's nobody telling you to repeat this thing every time you show up, in the drug world. It might be like, I would akin the drug world more to a hella dysfunctional family, but it's not culty. There's not that sort of be like all of us and we all must be the same. And if you don't, then you're wrong. It's not like that out there. Everybody's like, we all.
That's a good point to make. I wonder if that's just because it's such a broad world. It's a huge a huge spectrum of people. So I guess dysfunctional family is probably a better way to put it, because it's definitely not like the movies, right?
No, but there's too much freedom in the drug world. It's all about expression and be yourself and live out loud. It's a very excessive, hedonistic type of life. There's nobody trying to rein you in and tell you to do less. There's no leader. There is no monolith, and therefore it's not culty. Everybody is encouraged to be whatever the fuck they want to be, baby.
Well, that's a good point to make. So yeah, how would you relate that back to different people's relationship with drugs?
I mean, if you're at a point where you're questioning your relationship with the drugs, then you already know you have a problem. So, and that's for you to decide. So I can't tell anybody that, if you're only smoking weed once or twice a week, you don't have a problem with drugs. If you're never late for work, or your health looks fine, you know when you have a problem and when you don't. So if you even think that you need to reevaluate it, then you do. So I would say don't try to like rationalize that or try to make peace with that. If you're beginning to have reservations about your habits and your advice, maybe it's time to take a break for a month or two, detox, re-clarify, maybe schedule fasting from the drugs to maintain control over them, that sort of thing.
Right. You always want to be in control of the drugs. You don't want the drugs controlling you, for sure. What about someone who's never tried drugs? Let's say like a Christian, right? Or an ex-Christian, or someone who grew up in a Christian household who, was kind of scared of drugs, was warned drugs were terrible, but now they're thinking they might want to, let's say they live in Colorado, they might want to try shrooms or something, but they still have some of these hang-ups and some of these reservations about drugs. What advice would you give someone like that?
They need to find out why they have reservations, that's the same thing about the first question you asked a second ago. It's like, why do you have reservations? Like, what's going on? Is it because of the voices in your head from the church that you're arguing with, who told you it was wrong, but it's not really wrong, and now the government's telling you it's right, and you're caught in between that? Why do you have reservations? That's what I would need to know, because those reservations may not be valid.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's always important to evaluate if you're just doing something because you're told to, and just if you ever have reservations about anything, not just hard substances, but it's worth evaluating. It's also worth talking to a professional about. If you can afford a therapist or whatever, to run it by them, see what that's all about. Because when it comes to the topic of drug use, it's really about autonomy and safety. Like, be autonomous and be safe. Those are the important concepts. And the second you are not safe or you are not autonomous, that is when things need to be changed one way or another. Or at least that's how I would frame it. I don't know. Would you frame it that way, or do you have a different way you'd frame it?
Well, balance is everything. But also I would approach it with the understanding that you don't have to just because it's been made legal. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because it's available doesn't mean it's the right thing for you. So not only would I question why do I have reservations, but also why do I want to get into it in the first place? Is it because it's what my partner wants me to do? Is it because it's what my friends are doing? Or am I just being a curious human trying to have human experiences and try some shit? And also be open to the fact that it may not work and be willing to let it go. Realize it may work for some time and then may stop working, but always be willing to let it go.
Wow. That's amazing advice. Devannon, thank you so much for coming on. I felt out of my depth on this topic, and you brought so much important insight. I'm sure many people have fallen in love with the sound of your voice. So if they want to find your podcast, your book, all that, tell them how they do that.
The website is sexdrugsandjesus.com. Everything will be there.
Nice. Devannon, thank you so much for coming on. This was such a good conversation. I'm glad you were willing to come on and willing to have this talk.
Thank you for having me on, my sugar, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to have you back on. So yeah, thanks for everything. And thank you, listener, for stopping by. I will talk to y'all soon. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.